Hey, welcome to Christians in a Cancel Culture, a podcast where we talk about how to talk about what we're not supposed to talk about, and how to do it graciously, intelligently, biblically. We're glad you're here. Yeah, thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Dallas. Welcome to our podcast. Our subject today is racism and biblical unity. Our guests are Monique Duson and Krista Bontrager. I am so looking forward to hearing what these folks have to say to us. Racism. Okay, good grief. This podcast is geared to help us learn how to talk about what we are not supposed to talk about. I can't think of any subject that is more relevant to that goal than racism. You've got the reality of the thing itself, and then you've got the controversy generated when you bring the thing up. We can all agree racism is evil. And it's not just bad. Bad is when you do 75 in a 65 mile per hour zone. Evil, that's something else. And we know that some of the worst suffering ever inflicted on humanity has come through the evil of racism. No controversy that the thing is evil. The controversy, of course, is over what constitutes it and how we should respond to it, both as a culture and as the church. Last year, that question tore this country apart, didn't it? And we're still reeling over the effects of that, and we're still embroiled in controversy over what is true regarding racism. How should Christians in particular be expressing the biblical viewpoint on racism? And for that matter, what is the biblical viewpoint on racism? It seems like we are veering between one of two extremes. On the one extreme, you have those who say if you do not discuss the topic from the perspective of critical race theory, then you are a bigot and you have nothing responsible to say. Now, in reaction to that, a lot of people are saying, well, we are biblically based believers, so we don't want to touch the social issues at all, as if somehow being biblical and relevant are two separate things. There is a better way. And Paul advised us in that better way in Colossians chapter 4, verses 5-6. Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity, and let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Now that tells me three things. One, God has provided answers in his word to the controversial subject of racism. Number two, as stewards of truth, we are mandated to know those answers and to express them responsibly. And number three, expressing them responsibly means not only saying them clearly, but also speaking with grace, speech that is seasoned with salt. Well, today, we got a couple of pros who are going to help us understand exactly how to do that. Monique Duson is a missionary. She's a graduate of Biola. She is soon to be, hopefully, a student at Regent. She's a former advocate of critical race theory. She is now an advocate for biblical unity. Krista Bontrager is, by her own description, I like this, an accidental theologian. She's been in the apologetics field for over 2 decades now. Their ministry is the Center for Biblical Unity. One race, one people, one Savior. You gotta love that. Monique, Krista, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
We're glad to be here.
Glad to be here.
It is good to see you again, by the way. I have appreciated your work, and I've had the pleasure of talking with you before about other issues as well. But today, let's try to tackle this one. You know, looking at some of your prior interviews and looking over the material on your website, it reminded me that racism certainly is a doctrinal issue. Of course it is. But it is also a relational issue, a deeply relational issue. And that's what I'd like us to emphasize today is the relational aspect of the subject. With that in mind, Monique, could we begin with you? Can you tell us about where you stood on this issue by the time you had met Krista?
Yes, definitely. But I'm actually going to start out with a correction because my last name is Duson. There's an extra D. So I just want to make sure that everyone, when they if they search it or things like that, have the correct spelling.
My
DU.
bad. I am very
It
sorry.
is okay. There is so much grace for that. It is all good. Now, where was I in regards to my thoughts on racism and racial injustice, or just racism when I first met Krista? I think I had a framework or a way of thinking about white people that they participated in racism usually without even thinking about it. They were just parts of systems or structures that advantaged white people all the time. And that they thought so little about racism that the issue of racism wasn't even a problem for them. So, why would a white person speak out against racism if it didn't like help them in any way? Because they really never even thought about racism.
So, from that perspective, white people would not only be complicit in racism, they would also be somewhat indifferent then to racism.
Yes.
And I think that was
Yes,
definitely true
definitely.
in our relationship. Like when we first met, I had not reflected deeply at all about issues of race. And it caught me quite off guard as to how much Monique saw conversations that I thought were fairly benign. Like I remember making a comment once early in our friendship. I said, why is it that every conversation with you ends up in a conversation about slavery? Like everything leads back to slavery, even her hair. Like we were talking about her hair, and then like there was a few steps, and then we were talking about slavery. And I'm like, this is highly confusing for me because I think that posture of indifference, ignorance, because my race, I had not reflected deeply on that at all.
Mm-hmm. Were you at all familiar, Krista, with critical race theory by the time you met Monique?
Oh, no. I
Okay.
had not heard of that framework until a year and a half, almost 2 years into our friendship. I figured out fairly early on that Monique had some ideas that seemed influenced by postmodernism, which I had learned when I was in seminary back in the 90s. I thought, oh, she has some kind of postmodern-y ways of thinking. But I had never heard of critical theory or critical race theory. I was just starting to hear about social justice issues, but I was not a framework I was at all familiar with. What changed for me was I listened to a podcast by Neil Shenvi on the Elisa Childers podcast. And I remember calling like 10 people after I heard that podcast saying, you've got to go listen to this. This explains so much of what's happening in our culture right now. And once I had words, then I knew what to Google so that I could research and try to understand Monique's position a little bit better.
Now, backtracking just a little bit, how actually did your friendship come about? How did the two of you meet, and how did these conversations about race begin?
Well, I'll let you take that one.
Oh, you sure?
Go ahead.
All right. So we have some mutual friends. We were both involved in a previous ministry, the same ministry, but we didn't.
Based,
it was a leadership training type ministry, but we didn't know each other. We didn't know anything about each other. We didn't know of each other's existence. We were in different parts of the ministry, but we did have mutual friends that we had met through the ministry. And so there was a situation where a mutual friend of ours kind of got us connected, and we ended up starting to talk. And we just
shared like a live stream.
Yeah,
right?
She shared a live stream where Monique had been. Monique was at that time a missionary in South Africa, helping in low-income communities in Cape Flats. And she had come home on furlough, and she was giving a talk at a church while she was on missionary furlough. And this mutual friend of ours posted the video, and I was intrigued. And so we just started talking on Facebook and Zoom and became friends. And then when she came back from Africa, we thought it would be fun to get together for dinner.
Yeah.
So that we could meet each other in person.
Yes, you actually picked me up from the airport.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So that was kind of how it all started. So we had talked virtually to each other for 7 or 8 months before we met in person.
Really? It was
Yeah.
that long?
hmm
December to June.
June, yeah. November, December, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so
So-
when your friendship began, you were two Christian women, two grounded Christian women with experience in ministry, but with different views on racism or how it should be approached. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I think our views on race, justice, and unity were completely separate.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think that for both of us, I think I made huge assumptions about Monique because we were both raised by single mothers. We both grew up in Southern California. We had both graduated from Biola. So I made kind of a general assumption. I call it storytelling. I made up a little story in my head that she and I pretty much saw the world in a similar vein. And then a few months into the friendship, I started realizing, oh, that might not be true.
Yeah, and I think the exact opposite assumption, that we would see things extremely differently. And when we had conversations, I think that showed up my assumption that you're going to see things completely different than me because you're white.
Do
And so
you
we
think
were
that
both
is
reacting
common?
to each other from that posture. I was reacting to her with
Uh-huh.
the assumption in my mind, we probably agree. She was reacting from the assumption of we probably disagree.
Do you think that is common that an African American person will, from the beginning, assume, hey, we must see the world very differently because of our respective races, whereas a white person is going to assume, well, we probably see things the same way because we're both Christian?
That's a really
That's
good
a
question.
really good question.
I hate to categorize and be like, yes, all Black people probably think this way. I
Right.
don't know. I don't know that. If I were to take a snapshot of just like my friends at that time, I would say yes. That because of the conversations that happen within the community or within the family, about your ethnicity, your skin color, what it means to be Black, especially as a minority in a larger society that is predominantly white. Yes, I do think that at that time, the snapshot of my friends, it would have all been like, of course we think differently. Like, of course, you're not going to have a conversation about race because you don't need to, because you're in the majority group.
Mhm.
Where we are sitting as the minority and always wondering what are people thinking about us, because of the color of our skin, because of the way our hair looks, because of X, Y, and Z. And I think some of my thoughts about that have changed over the course of the last 3 years, but at that time I could definitely say yes. And yeah, I think that depending on, the group you're talking to and where that person comes from. But I think there is a lot of things that we miss just because of sometimes our culture or our cultural makeup.
Yeah, I
Yes.
think for me that is true of the people that I interacted with at my church. If I were to take a snapshot of those people at that time that I was interacting with, I think most of us had not thought too much about our race, our skin color, or even our culture. Most of us were just operating in a world of like, I'm a Christian and
Mhm.
I have immediate connection with all Christians. And so it didn't occur to me until we were kind of deep into the friendship. Oh, that's not how Monique thinks of me first. She actually thinks of me first as a white person. And I had been mostly thinking of her first as a sister in the Lord. And so then we were kind of on this crash course. For me, I think part of Monique's project was to make me more aware of my whiteness. And part of my project was I was trying to think about helping her think about her identity in Christ. So we had very different purposes in a lot of the conversations.
And, in my very limited experience, I have seen that often that is when the conversation shuts down. Oh, I thought we were on the same page about everything. It looks like we're not. I'm withdrawing.
Mhm.
This is going to get weird. This is going to get testy, or I'm going to get challenged, or you're going to get challenged, or I don't know what to do with it. And that is exactly when I think a lot of people feel like, oh, well, it's not worth it. It's too scary. It's too what have you. How did the subject of race start coming up in your conversations, and how did you both deal with it?
I remember I assumed that she was a Trump supporter
because I was white.
because she was white. And I remember asking her back when I still was in South Africa if you voted for Trump, and she didn't answer the question. And so that kind of, I think, just let me know, like, well, Republican, Trump supporter, there it is.
Racist.
Yeah. And then I
didn't vote for Trump, but I didn't want to make that the focus of the conversation. So I kept avoiding the question because I felt like there were other questions that were more important. So I wanted to talk about policies and issues, and I felt like it was a test. It was like, well, if you voted for Trump, then I'm going to make these assumptions about you. And so I avoided the question. And because I avoided the question, she went ahead and made some assumptions about me.
Well, I also think, though, that there were a lot what you're just saying now is that you thought that there were other things that were more important to talk about was an assumption.
Yeah.
Assumption that I was going to judge you. So I think that we both had assumptions flowing back and forth.
Unspoken.
Like she assumed a lot of things about me. I assumed a lot of things about her. I remember going on a hike with you and asking some question about racism or something like that, and maybe it was like what you thought about the poor, something like that. And you were like, I don't want to talk about that. And I was like, wow. Where I think for me growing up, I grew up in South LA. We grew up pretty poor. I studied sociology. I worked in social service for the majority of my career. These were all very important conversations for me. And I honestly think that in a lot of African-American circles, these are important conversations on how do you view the world. So when there's someone who's white, who's just like, I don't talk about that. We don't need to talk about that. Like that automatically puts us at odds because it's like, well, maybe you do, but I think that the assumption that can come forward is, well, you don't care.
Right. And I think on that hike, I remember that vividly, that my concern in talking about that was that I didn't want to spoil this nice little friendship I had going with her. And it was still fairly early on in the process. And so when I was like kind of on the fence about, do I talk about this? Do I not? Because I could tell by that point, I probably had a different viewpoint on helping the poor than she did. And I could tell by that point that she had much more, I assumed she had a much more socialist leaning approach to helping the poor, whereas I was also passionate about helping the poor, but I had more of a free market approach. And I was like, do I really want to start getting into that? We're going on a hike. I don't want to spoil this nice little friendship, but we did eventually have those conversations, but I was very reluctant in the beginning, definitely.
See, to me, this is important because it sounds as though our hesitations based on our presumptions cause us to withhold information, and that can be interpreted as indifference. It's not. It's simply a desire to maintain a good bond, but even that is based on the assumption that we have to be completely on the same page and we can't exchange ideas in order to preserve a good bond.
Yeah. And
right, so
I was really wanting that exchange of ideas. I was longing for that, but I was so scared. And so that led to a lot of paralysis for me.
That's a good way of putting it. I've often said, I think intimidation oftentimes gets interpreted as indifference.
Yeah.
And that's not the case at all.
Yeah.
What happened, Monique, to the way you viewed Krista and the way you viewed the positions you had held as these conversations continued between you two?
Well, for a long time, I think that a lot of her answers just reinforced my position. And it just, well, let me start with this. One of the things that Krista and I did early on was we said we were going to be committed to one another, like no matter what. Like we weren't going to just give up willy-nilly and be like, well, forget you. I don't want to talk to you anymore. Like we were going to be in it for the long haul, no matter what happened. And for me, I take those commitments seriously. I'm not always good at them, I don't mess up in between them, but the commitment is the commitment. And so we had a lot of hard conversations. A lot of what you said, I think, reinforced some of the narrative that I already had. And it didn't help to break down any of the structures, I think, that were in my brain about white people. I think what eventually led to me beginning to shift some of my ideas, where we were having a conversation in the car, and we were sitting in front of our driveway, and she was like,
because we should probably explain that Monique lives with my family.
Yeah. We all live together. So these conversations were real fun. They were real, because wasn't nobody going nowhere.
You don't get to walk away from it.
No, we were living in the same house, and my husband and my kids were there, and so
it was big fun. Big fun. So we were sitting in the car, and I was explaining like racism and how I see racism and all these things in white people, because of course I was the expert at that time. And Krista turned to me and was like, "You think I'm a racist? You just called me a racist." And I was like, "Well, no,
not technically."
And she was like, the crying. And I am just like, I don't understand why you can't see this. Like from the words that were being spoken, that just to me felt so indifferent. And based on, I think, a lot of what I was eventually taught in university about racism and white structures and things like that, I was like, well, I know you don't see it right now because you are, actively in this, but this really is like racism. And
she, I mean, at this point, she had been living with our family for like a year.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what do I have to do to prove to you that, you're one of our family, and, my kids call you their sister, and we all help each other. And, Monique had some difficulties in transitioning back from the mission field, and my husband and I had given her a place to live and trying to help support her through that transition. And I'm like, how do I prove to you any other way that we are not racist? And I don't know. But imagine me like having the ugly cry while I'm saying this. Like it was really a rough moment.
And my little uncharitable heart just sitting there like, I don't know what to say. There is, I think there is the idea of racism, and you find this especially when you're looking at some of the critical social theories. So there's a way that we think about racism, especially when upholding like the critical race theory framework. And one of those ways is interpersonal. So Krista to me, me to Krista, Krista's husband and kids to me, or me to them. And that wasn't what I was talking about. What I was talking about was more of the unconscious bias that people can hold, or the way that people may think about race or ethnicity, poverty, that they don't necessarily even know is there. And so those thoughts or interactions with certain systems like the judicial system or the banking system can lead to disparity between races. And it can also lead to some, more, I would say, harsh realities for certain ethnic groups. And so when I was saying, well, you might just be a racist, what I was not saying was that I think that you are harboring hatred in your heart toward me. What I was saying is that you actually have some thoughts about ethnic groups or about the way in which we participate in society that is hindering Black people.
Well, I guess you can see Monique and Krista have a lot to say. They got a lot to say about racism, what it is, what it's not. They've got a lot to say about how you can view a social issue from a biblical perspective. They've especially got a lot to say to us about the power of conversation. What happens when we listen to each other with humility and we speak to each other honestly? Those are some pretty vital lessons. Now, in part 2 of this episode, we're going to hear more from Monique. We're going to hear about how her views on critical race theory changed, but her commitment to social justice did not. We're also going to be hearing from Krista about how she came to realize that just having the right talking points is not quite enough to win somebody over. Those are vital lessons. So be sure to join us for next week's episode on racism, the biblical view of it and the Christ-like way to express that view. If you want to learn more about the Center for Biblical Unity, or if you want to contact Monique and Krista, you can just check out their website at centerforbiblicalunity.com. That's centerforbiblicalunity.com. Be sure to join us again as we hear more from Krista and Monique for part 2 of our podcast series on racism and grace. Let's talk about both. Meanwhile, let's also remember the good advice Paul gave to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2, verses 24 to 25. The servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle to all, apt to teach, patient, in meekness, instructing those who oppose themselves, if perhaps God will grant them repentance according to the knowledge of the truth. He sure got that one right. You know, when it comes to the truth, it is not just where you stand that counts, it is also how you stand. Thanks for being here. God bless.